The crisp morning air nipped at Karen Foster's cheeks as she adjusted her grip on Max's leash. Her retired K-9 German Shepherd moved with purpose, his nose working overtime against the autumn wind. 20 years as a veterinarian had taught her to read animals like books, and something was different about Max's behavior today. His ears were perked forward, his muscles tense beneath his thick coat. Karen checked her watch. 5:47 a.m. The sun hadn't yet risen over Miller's Road, and the abandoned industrial area cast long shadows across their usual walking path. Max suddenly stopped, his entire body becoming rigid. Karen had seen this posture hundreds of times during his service years. It meant he'd found something. Before she could tighten her grip, Max yanked the leash, pulling her toward a dense patch of overgrown bushes near the roadside. Karen's heart skipped a beat when a faint sound reached her ears, a sound that didn't belong among the morning crickets and distant traffic. Max's whining grew more insistent as he pawed at the brambles. Karen pushed aside the thorny branches, her veterinarian instincts taking over. She expected to find an injured animal, maybe a cat or a raccoon. Instead, her hand froze mid-motion as she glimpsed something blue and cotton soft peeking through the leaves. A baby blanket. Her mind refused to process what her eyes were seeing. The bundle moved slightly, and a tiny fist emerged from the folds of the fabric. The world around Karen seemed to stop. The baby couldn't have been more than a few months old. Skin pale from the cold but still breathing, Max had already wedged himself as close to the infant as possible, his body heat providing crucial warmth. Karen's trembling fingers reached for her phone, muscle memory dialing 911 while her other hand reached out to touch the baby's cheek. Checking for temperature. She was a vet, not a pediatrician, but she knew hypothermia when she saw it. Detective Amanda Chen was just ending her graveyard shift when the call came in. A baby found off Miller's Road, still alive. As she maneuvered her unmarked car through the early morning traffic, her mind raced through protocols and procedures. But something else nagged at her, a memory she'd spent years trying to forget. 17 years ago, she'd worked a similar case. That one hadn't ended well. She gripped the steering wheel tighter, pushing away the image of another cold morning, another abandoned child. This time would be different. It had to be. The flash of emergency lights up ahead told her she'd reached the scene. As she stepped out of her car, she saw a woman cradling a bundle, while a large German Shepherd stood guard. Scanning the surroundings with military precision, what happened next would haunt Karen for years to come as emergency services arrived and the paramedics approached. Max's behavior shifted dramatically. Instead of backing away, he positioned himself between the baby and the newcomers, only relaxing when Karen assured him with gentle words. The paramedics worked around the dog, seeming to understand that this unlikely guardian wasn't going to leave his post. Detective Chen approached carefully, her notepad ready, but her eyes were fixed on Max. "Your dog," she said. "He's not just any retired K-9, is he?" Karen shook her head, watching as Max followed the baby's every movement. "He specialized in finding lost children," she replied softly. "In all his years of service, he never failed to bring one home alive." Chen's expression darkened. "Well," she said, pocketing her notepad, "looks like he's not done serving yet." David Mitchell watched the scene unfold from nearly a mile away, his hands shaking on the steering wheel of his parked car. Through binoculars meant for birdwatching, a hobby from what felt like another lifetime, he witnessed the discovery of his son. Tears streamed down his face as he observed the gentleness with which the German Shepherd had found Jimmy, his baby boy, the same son he'd convinced himself would be better off without him, better off found by someone with the means to provide what he couldn't. The dog's protective stance around his child struck something deep within David's soul, shattering the fragile justifications he'd built around his desperate act. As police cars began to arrive, he lowered the binoculars. His decision already made, he couldn't run from this. The dog's unwavering devotion to protecting his son had shown him what real strength looked like. With trembling fingers, he started his car. He would turn himself in, but first, he needed to make sure they knew something crucial. His son's name was James. He was 3 months old, and he was allergic to penicillin. David Mitchell sat in the Stark interrogation room, his work uniform still covered in grease from his night shift at the truck stop. Across the table, Detective Chen studied him with eyes that had seen too many similar cases, yet something about this one felt different. David's hands wouldn't stop shaking as he placed them flat on the metal table, the fluorescent lights highlighting every oil stain under his broken nails. He'd been working doubles for months, trying to keep up with the medical bills. The rent, The formula. Everything that had spiraled since Sarah's death. The words tumbled out of him like a broken dam. 3 months of isolated desperation, finally finding release. "I thought," he stammered, "I thought someone with money, with a real family, would find him. I waited there all night watching, making sure it would be someone good." Detective Chen's partner had brought in the medical reports from the hospital. Baby James was stable, his body temperature returning to normal, thanks to the quick action of the dog and his owner, as David recounted the events leading up to that morning. Chen found herself mapping out a tragedy that started long before today. Sarah Mitchell had died from complications during childbirth, leaving David with a newborn and mounting medical debt. No family to turn to, 3 jobs that barely covered the basics, and a baby with special needs that required constant care. The breaking point had come 2 days ago when David lost his day job at the warehouse. The final safety net had snapped, and with it, his hope of providing for his son. "I sat outside the emergency room for hours," David whispered, his voice cracking, "watching other parents walk in and out, parents who could afford to keep their children healthy." Karen Foster stood on the other side of the two-way mirror, Max sitting alertly at her feet. She'd been asked to stay and provide a statement, but something about this case had rooted her to the spot. She watched as David Mitchell broke down describing his son's medical needs. The same needs she'd specialized in treating in animals for 2 decades. The irony wasn't lost on her. She could save any creature that walked into her clinic, often pro bono, but human healthcare remained a luxury for many. Max's ears perked up every time David's voice cracked, the dog's innate ability to sense distress evident in his posture. Karen found herself reaching for her phone, fingers hovering over her sister's number. Rachel was a pediatric nurse. Maybe there was a way to help that didn't involve destroying more lives. The revelation about James's medical condition had set off a chain of urgent calls to the hospital. Detective Chen watched as David provided detailed information about his son's health history. His hands still shaking, but his voice growing stronger with each vital detail shared. This wasn't the typical case of abandonment she'd encountered before. No drugs, no criminal record, just a father drowning in a system that had failed him at every turn. She thought about her own father, who had faced similar impossible choices as a single parent. The difference was, he'd had family to turn to. Looking at David Mitchell, Chen saw what her father could have become without that support. She glanced at the child services paperwork on her desk, then at Karen Foster, who hadn't left her observation post. Sometimes, Chen thought, justice needed to wear a different face in the hospital across town. James slept peacefully in the pediatric unit, unaware of the wheels his rescue had set in motion. His attending nurse, Rachel Foster, had just received a call from her sister Karen that would change multiple lives. As she looked down at the baby boy, touching the medical alert bracelet that marked his penicillin allergy, Rachel remembered something their mother used to say. "Sometimes the family you need finds you in the strangest ways." Outside the hospital window, the sun was finally rising over the city, casting long shadows that looked almost like outstretched hands. Reaching toward second chances, Karen Foster paced the hospital corridor, her footsteps echoing against the sterile walls, while her sister Rachel finished her shift in the pediatric unit. Max sat vigilantly by the nursery window, his eyes fixed on baby James through the glass. Several nurses had already commented on the dog's unusual behavior. How he'd growl softly whenever someone unfamiliar approached the nursery. Karen couldn't shake the image of David Mitchell's face from her mind, the same desperate look she'd seen in countless pet owners who couldn't afford treatment for their beloved animals. She'd found ways around that in her practice, building payment plans, accepting trades for services, sometimes even waiving fees entirely. But this situation was infinitely more complex. She stopped pacing when Rachel emerged from the break room, still in her scrubs, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "I've been thinking," Rachel began, handing 1 cup to Karen while settling into a hard plastic chair. "Remember how Mum and Dad set up that healthcare fund before they passed? The one we've barely touched?" Karen nodded, already seeing where her sister's thoughts were heading. Their parents had left them a significant sum, earmarked for medical emergencies, but neither sister had needed it. Rachel continued, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "James's condition is manageable with proper care. The medications, the routine checkups. It's not about curing him. It's about maintaining his health." Karen watched as Max's ears twitched at the mention of James's name, his attention never wavering from the nursery. "But it's not just about money," Karen replied. thinking about the legal implications, the system they'd be navigating. This is about giving both of them a chance. Detective Chen had spent the morning making calls, pulling strings she didn't even know she had. David Mitchell's case had struck a chord with her superiors, particularly when they learned about his clean record and immediate surrender. The fact that he'd ensured his son's safety, choosing a location where the baby would be found quickly, and providing crucial medical information, all pointed to a father acting out of desperation rather than malice. She was now sitting in her office, staring at a stack of papers that could change lives. Alternative sentencing programs existed for cases like this, but they required stable support systems, proof of rehabilitation potential, and most importantly, people willing to advocate for the accused. Her phone buzzed. A message from Karen Foster, asking for a meeting. Chen allowed herself a small smile. Sometimes the pieces fell into place in unexpected ways. Rachel Foster had seen her share of difficult cases in pediatrics. But something about James Mitchell and his father had burrowed deep into her heart. During her rounds, she'd noticed how the baby seemed to calm instantly whenever Max was visible through the nursery window. The hospital administrator had been surprisingly accommodating about allowing the dog's presence, especially after learning about his K-9 background. As she checked James's vitals, Rachel thought about the conversation she'd just had with her sister. Their parents had always taught them that wealth was meant to be shared. That true legacy wasn't about money, but about the lives you touched. She looked at her phone, at the text she'd been composing to her lawyer friend who specialized in family court cases. Sometimes the right thing to do was also the hardest to explain. The meeting room in the police station felt less intimidating with Max present, his steady presence a balm to the tension in the air. Karen and Rachel sat beside each other, facing Detective Chen across the table. David Mitchell had been brought in, still in custody but no longer in handcuffs. The sisters' proposal was unprecedented, but not impossible. A comprehensive support system that would allow David to maintain custody of James while fulfilling his legal obligations. Karen spoke about converting part of her veterinary clinic's apartment into a living space, offering David work, managing the clinic's books and maintenance. Rachel detailed the medical support plan they'd devised, including regular checkups and medication management. As they laid out their proposal, Max moved to sit beside David. Resting his head on the man's knee, Detective Chen watched this simple gesture and thought about redemption, about how second chances sometimes wore fur and carried badges from different kinds of service. The transformation of the veterinary clinic's upstairs apartment happened in stages, each box and piece of furniture telling its own story of hope. Karen supervised the renovation, while David worked alongside the contractors, his experience in maintenance proving invaluable. The space had been her private retreat for years, but watching it evolve into a home for a father and son felt right. Max patrolled the construction area, with surprising attention to detail, barking whenever something wasn't up to his standards, particularly around the baby's future room. David noticed how the dog would sit for hours in that specific room, as if memorizing every corner, every potential hazard. The same protective instinct that had saved James's life seemed to extend to ensuring his future safety. During breaks, David would sit on the floor beside Max, sometimes talking softly about his fears and hopes, the dog's presence somehow making it easier to voice thoughts he'd kept buried. Detective Chen's daily reports became less about monitoring potential problems and more about documenting a unique rehabilitation case. She watched as David threw himself into learning the clinic's operations, his natural aptitude for numbers surprising everyone. The man who had felt so hopeless now spent his lunch break studying veterinary office management. Determined to make himself indispensable, Chen noticed other changes too, how he'd started keeping a detailed journal of James's medical needs, coordinating with Rachel to create a foolproof care schedule. But what struck her most was how he'd stop whatever he was doing whenever an animal in distress was brought into the clinic, offering to help hold them, or simply speaking in that gentle voice he used with his son. The same voice that had cracked during his confession now soothed frightened pets and reassured worried owners. Rachel's role evolved beyond just being James's nurse. She found herself becoming part of an unconventional support system, her medical expertise bridging the gap between human and veterinary care. During her visits to the clinic, she'd often find David in deep conversation with Karen about animal medications, drawing parallels to James's treatments. His determination to understand every aspect of his son's care touched her deeply. One afternoon, while explaining a new medication schedule, Rachel noticed something that made her pause. David had created a color-coded chart that mirrored the ones used in the clinic for critical care animals. He'd taken Karen's veterinary protocols and adapted them for James's needs, creating a system that was both thorough and intuitive. It was moments like these that reassured her they'd made the right decision. The clinic's regular clients quickly adapted to the changes, many of them becoming unexpected allies in David and James's journey. Mrs. Henderson, whose arthritic golden retriever required weekly therapy, started bringing extra portions of her famous casseroles. Mr. Zhang, whose cat was a frequent boarder, turned out to be a retired pediatric physical therapist and offered free consultations. The waiting room became a place where David learned he wasn't alone. Where other parents shared stories of their own struggles and triumphs, Max seemed to take particular pride in this community building, often leading nervous new clients to the comfortable chairs. His presence a constant reminder of how this all began. Karen watched these interactions from her office, noting how the clinic's healing energy had expanded beyond just animals to encompass human healing as well. For James, the clinic became more than just a home. It became his first classroom at 6 months old. He was reaching all his developmental milestones. Surrounded by the gentle sounds of healing and care, his allergies were carefully managed through the combined expertise of both foster sisters, while his father's growing confidence reflected in his own happy demeanor. The baby's favorite spot was a carefully padded corner of Karen's office, where he could watch the daily activities while Max kept his constant vigil. The dog had developed an almost uncanny ability to predict James's needs, alerting David or Karen moments before the baby would wake or become uncomfortable. Detective Chen, during her now weekly visits, often wondered if this was what true rehabilitation looked like, not just avoiding punishment, but building something new, something stronger than what was broken. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, its official letterhead casting a shadow over the clinic's peaceful routine. David's hands trembled as he read the contents. Sarah's parents had somehow learned about the incident and were filing for custody of James. They had been absent since Sarah's death, their grief manifesting as blame towards David for their daughter's passing. Now, almost a year later, they emerged with lawyers and accusations. Karen found him in the storage room, sitting among the medical supplies. The letter crumpled in his fist. Max had already assumed his protective position beside them, his body pressed against David's leg in silent support. The dog's presence had become such a constant source of strength that even in this moment of crisis, David found himself automatically reaching to scratch behind Max's ears, the familiar gesture helping to ground him in the present rather than spiraling into panic. Detective Chen received the call from Karen while reviewing old case files. The timing wasn't coincidental. She'd been researching similar custody battles, her instincts warning her that James's story wasn't over yet. Sarah's parents, the Whitakers, were prominent figures in their community 3 states over, with resources and connections that dwarfed the modest support system David had built. But Chen had seen something in this case that went beyond legal precedence. She gathered her files, including the detailed reports of David's rehabilitation progress, the documented improvements in James's health under the current arrangement, and most importantly, the community impact statements she'd been quietly collecting. As she drove to the clinic, Chen reflected on how her own father had fought similar battles, his love proving stronger than any legal argument against him. The system sometimes needed reminding that family wasn't defined by wealth or status. Rachel arrived at the clinic during her lunch break, medical records in hand. The paperwork documented every aspect of James's care since the incident, his improving health, his developmental progress, the successful management of his condition. But what wasn't in the papers was equally important: the way James lit up whenever David entered the room. His first words being a mix of Dada and Max, the secure attachment that was obvious to anyone who spent time with them. As a pediatric nurse, Rachel had seen her share of family dynamics, both healthy and troubled. The bond between David and James was something special, something that had been tested by fire and emerged stronger. She watched through the office window as David went about his clinic duties, James secured in a carrier on his chest, Max following faithfully behind them. The sight steeled her resolve. Some families were chosen, built rather than born, and they were worth fighting for. The clinic's waiting room transformed into an impromptu war room that evening after closing. Karen's laptop displayed emails from local lawyers who'd heard about the case through the veterinary community network. Mr. Zhang had reached out to his contacts in family services. While Mrs. Henderson organized other clients to write character references, the support was overwhelming, but David couldn't shake the fear. He watched James sleeping in his portable crib, Max maintaining his usual guard position, and thought about Sarah. She had always believed in building bridges rather than walls, even with her difficult parents. The memory of her strength gave him an idea, one that might seem naive to others but felt right in his heart. With trembling fingers, he began composing an email to the Whitakers. Not a legal response, but a letter from one grieving heart to another, attached with photos of James's life at the clinic, his achievements, his smiles, and most importantly, the family he had found. The implications of the custody battle reached beyond the immediate family. Karen found herself examining her own attachments, particularly to Max, who had become so much more than just her retired K-9 partner. The dog had orchestrated this entire journey, from the discovery of James to the daily healing that happened within the clinic's walls. Now, as she watched him nudge a toy closer to James's crib with his usual gentle precision, she understood something profound about loyalty and purpose. Max had found his new mission that morning on Miller's Road, not just saving a baby, but saving a family. The dog looked up at her with those knowing eyes, and Karen made a silent promise. They had created something special here, something worth protecting as the evening wound down and plans were made for the legal battle ahead. Max settled into his spot between James's crib and David's chair, a living bridge between all the people he had brought together. The Whitakers arrived unannounced on a rainy Thursday morning. Their luxury SUV looking out of place among the clinic's modest parking lot. Eleanor Whitaker, Sarah's mother, stepped out first, her designer clothes and perfectly maintained appearance a stark contrast to the practical setting of the veterinary clinic. Her husband Robert followed, his face set in grim determination. They had expected to find their grandson in squalid conditions, ammunition for their custody case. Instead, they walked into a scene that stopped them in their tracks. Through the clinic's front window, they could see David in his neat clinic uniform, professionally handling paperwork, while James played contentedly in a clean, well-equipped playpen. Max's reaction was immediate but controlled. The dog positioned himself between the newcomers and his charges, not aggressive but unmistakably protective. Karen emerged from her office, her professional demeanor masking her own turbulent emotions. The meeting that followed in Karen's office crackled with tension. Eleanor's carefully prepared accusations faltered as she took in the wall of photos showing James's progress over the past year. There was her grandson, healthy and smiling, in scene after scene of his daily life. David attending parenting classes, James at his medical checkups, father and son participating in community events, all documented with meticulous care. Robert Whitaker's attention was drawn to the certificate on the wall showing David's completion of financial management courses. The narrative they had constructed of a negligent father began to crack. Throughout the conversation, Max remained by James's playpen, his presence a silent reminder of the morning that had changed everything. David sat quietly, letting the evidence of his transformation speak for itself, his hands steady as he held the journal documenting every detail of his son's care. Detective Chen arrived halfway through the confrontation, her timing deliberate. She had waited to see how the Whitakers would approach the situation before presenting her own findings. As she spread her files across Karen's desk, she spoke with the authority of someone who had watched this case unfold from its darkest moment to its current reality. The police reports, the rehabilitation documentation, the community testimonials, each piece built a picture that was impossible to dismiss, but it was the security footage from the clinic that delivered the most powerful message. Eleanor watched, tears forming in her eyes as the screen showed countless moments of genuine connection between David and James. Max's constant presence in these clips provided a through line of stability and protection that no amount of wealth could replicate. Jen noticed how Robert's hand found his wife's, their shared grief finally finding a crack in their anger. Rachel chose that moment to deliver her medical report, her professional expertise lending weight to every word. She detailed James's health improvements, the successful management of his condition, and most importantly, the strong attachment between father and son that any child development expert would praise. As she spoke, James began to fuss in his playpen. The room watched as David instinctively responded, his movements gentle and assured. Max alerted before the baby even started crying, demonstrating the intricate support system that had developed. Eleanor Whitaker's carefully constructed walls began to crumble as she witnessed the depth of care her grandson received. The love she saw wasn't what she had expected. It was better, richer, more complete than she had imagined possible. Sarah would have understood this, she realized with a start. Her daughter had always seen the best in David. The turning point came when James reached for David, clearly choosing his father's comfort over the unfamiliar presence of his grandparents. The baby's trust was absolute, his security in his father's arms evident to everyone in the room. Robert Whitaker, a man accustomed to winning, found himself facing a battle where victory would mean destroying something beautiful. He watched as Max gently nudged a fallen toy back toward James. The dog's dedication, another piece of evidence that this unlikely family unit worked. The Whitakers had come armed with lawyers and threats, but they found themselves confronting a different kind of strength, one built on love, community, and second chances. As the rain continued outside, Eleanor reached into her designer bag and slowly withdrew the custody papers. Her hands trembled as she tore them in half. The sound of ripping paper accompanied by her first genuine sob since losing Sarah. Sometimes, she realized, healing comes in unexpected forms, and family expands in ways you never imagined possible. Eleanor Whitaker found herself returning to the clinic a week later. Alone this time, she sat in her car for several minutes, watching the morning routine through the window. David was opening up for the day, James securely strapped to his chest in a carrier, while Max performed his usual security sweep of the premises. The scene was so different from what she'd imagined all these months, so full of life and purpose. When she finally entered, the bell above the door announcing her presence, Max approached her with cautious curiosity. The dog's assessment felt more meaningful than any social judgment she'd ever faced. David froze briefly at the sight of her, but his voice remained steady as he offered her coffee. In his arms, James babbled happily, reaching for his grandmother's pearl necklace, the one Sarah had always admired. The simple gesture broke something loose in Eleanor's carefully maintained composure. Karen observed the interaction from her office, ready to intervene if needed. But something told her to wait. Eleanor had arrived carrying a large photo album, its leather cover worn with age as she opened it on the clinic's reception counter. David recognized Sarah's childhood photos. There she was, age 6, proudly holding her first pet kitten. Another showed her as a teenager, volunteering at an animal shelter. A detail about his late wife he'd never known. Through tears, Eleanor shared stories of Sarah's love for animals, her dream of working with them someday, dreams that had been set aside for the corporate career her parents had pushed her toward. Max settled beside Eleanor's chair as she spoke, his presence seeming to make the sharing of grief easier. David listened, James cradled in his arms as the woman who had been his adversary became something else, a keeper of Sarah's memories, a bridge to parts of his wife's life he'd never known. Rachel arrived for her regular checkup of James to find an unexpected scene in the exam room. Eleanor was there, learning from David about James's care routine. The grandmother's designer outfit was slightly rumpled as she practiced preparing her grandson's medications under David's patient guidance. There was something profound in watching this elegant woman humble herself to learn, her manicured hands carefully measuring doses while David explained the importance of each step. Max supervised the lesson from his spot by the door, his approval evident in his relaxed posture. Rachel shared a knowing look with her sister. Healing rarely followed a straight line, but sometimes the unexpected paths led to the deepest recoveries. When James reached for Eleanor, she held him with trembling hands, inhaling the baby's scent that connected her to both her grandson and her lost daughter. The transformation continued over cups of coffee and shared stories in the clinic's break room. Eleanor revealed how she and Robert had been devastated by Sarah's death. Their grief calcifying into blame and anger, fighting for custody, had seemed like a way to keep Sarah's memory alive, to maintain control over something when they'd lost so much. But watching David with James, seeing the community that had formed around them, she recognized something Sarah would have loved. Her daughter had always believed in the power of second chances, in building families of choice as much as blood. As she spoke about releasing that anger, Max rested his head on her lap, offering the same comfort he'd given so many others in this journey. David listened, understanding that healing wasn't just about his redemption anymore. It was about all of them finding their way back to life after loss. That evening, as the clinic was closing, Eleanor made an unexpected proposal. Instead of fighting over James, Why not work together to make sure he knew all sides of his mother's story? She and Robert had resources that could help secure James's future, while David and his newfound family could provide the daily love and stability the boy needed. The idea of cooperation instead of competition hung in the air like a fragile hope. Karen watched as David considered the offer, his hand absently stroking Max's fur, a gesture that had become his way of finding clarity. When he finally nodded, the smile that broke across Eleanor's face was genuine, perhaps her first real smile since losing her daughter, as if sensing the significance of the moment. James chose that instant to take his first wobbling steps, launching himself from David's legs toward his grandmother, while Max hovered protectively nearby, ready to catch him if he fell. It was a small step for a toddler, but a giant leap for their healing family. The clinic's schedule expanded to include Sunday dinners, a tradition Eleanor insisted on starting. The first few gatherings were awkward, with Robert Whittaker stiffly perched on a clinic stool while David prepared the upstairs apartment for guests. But it was James who bridged the gap. His toddler energy demanding attention from everyone equally, Max proved instrumental in these gatherings, his instinct for emotional tensions helping him know exactly when to interrupt a heavy silence with a well-timed nudge or playful gesture. Karen watched as her clinic's break room transformed each Sunday into something that felt increasingly like home, complete with Eleanor's tentative attempts at learning to cook simpler meals, a skill she'd never needed in her world of catered events and restaurant reservations. The burning of occasional dinners became a source of shared laughter, rather than tension. Robert's transformation was subtler, but no less significant. A retired corporate lawyer, he began finding ways to apply his expertise to help the clinic grow. What started as casual suggestions about liability insurance evolved into detailed plans for expanding the clinic's pro bono services. During one Sunday dinner, he surprised everyone by presenting David with paperwork for a small foundation in Sarah's name, designed to help pet owners facing financial hardships similar to what David had experienced. The moment was made more poignant by Max choosing that exact time to place his favorite toy in Robert's lap, a gesture of acceptance that left the usually stoic man fighting back tears. David watched his former adversary become an ally. Understanding that grief could either break bonds or forge new ones, they were choosing the harder but more rewarding path. Rachel's medical expertise took on new dimensions as she helped coordinate between James's pediatric care and the Foundation's mission. She discovered that many families struggling with children's medical bills often had similar difficulties caring for their pets. The intersection of these needs led to innovative programs at the clinic, with David's experience becoming invaluable in understanding both sides of the equation. During Foundation meetings, James would play in his specially designed corner of the conference room, occasionally toddling over to help with paperwork. While Max maintained his self-appointed role as chief security officer and emotional support companion, Eleanor found herself spending more time at these meetings than at her country club. Her designer outfits gradually replaced by more practical clothes suited to clinic work. The change in her wardrobe reflected a deeper transformation in her priorities. Detective Chen's official monitoring of David's case had ended months ago, but she remained a regular visitor to the clinic on this particular Sunday. She arrived with news that brought everything full circle. The department was interested in implementing a program inspired by their case, connecting families in crisis with support services before desperation led to drastic decisions. As she shared the details over dinner, Chen watched the interaction between all these people who had once been strangers or adversaries. James was falling asleep in his high chair, one hand clutching his grandfather's tie, while the other reached for Max's fur. David and Robert were deep in conversation about expanding the Foundation's reach. While Eleanor and Karen discussed adding a children's reading program where kids could practice reading to calm shelter dogs, the scene represented everything Chen had hoped for but hadn't dared expect when she first took the case. Not just rehabilitation, but genuine transformation for everyone involved. The evening wound down with a new ritual that had emerged naturally over the weeks as David prepared James for bed. Eleanor would share a story about Sarah, usually something from her childhood that revealed another piece of the woman they had all loved in different ways. Tonight's story was about Sarah's first job as a teenager, walking dogs in their neighborhood. Robert added his own memories, recalling how she had used her earnings to help pay for emergency surgery for an elderly neighbor's cat. The story hit home for everyone in the room. It was exactly the kind of thing their foundation now did. Max listened to the storytelling from his spot beside James's crib, his presence a constant reminder of how this family had found each other. As the Whitakers prepared to leave, Eleanor paused to straighten a family photo on the wall, one that now included all of them. Taken at the foundation's opening ceremony, the image captured a moment of genuine joy, with Max front and center, the faithful guardian who had brought healing to so many broken hearts. The Sarah Mitchell Foundation's first major case arrived on a stormy Tuesday morning. A young mother, Jessica Torres, stood in the clinic's waiting room, soaking wet and clutching both a sick cat and a toddler about James's age. The parallels weren't lost on David, as he recognized the same desperation in her eyes that he'd once felt. Max immediately went into his service mode, gently guiding the woman to a seat, while Karen rushed to assess the cat's condition. The animal needed emergency surgery, a cost far beyond Jessica's means as a single parent working 2 jobs. David caught Eleanor's eye across the room, where she was organizing the foundation's filing system. No words were needed. This was exactly why they had created this safety net. Within hours, Jessica's cat was in surgery. Her toddler was playing with James in the supervised play area, and she was learning about the Foundation's comprehensive support program. The Foundation's work began attracting attention from unexpected quarters. Robert's corporate connections, initially skeptical of his new passion project, started taking notice of the innovative way the program integrated animal and human welfare. Local news covered the story of how a retired K-9 unit dog had inspired a movement that was changing lives. The publicity brought more cases but also more support. David found himself sharing his story at community meetings, his natural reserve giving way to quiet confidence as he explained how helping animals could also mean helping families. Max would accompany him to these presentations, his presence adding weight to the message about second chances and unconditional love during one such event. A local business owner approached them about expanding the model to other neighborhoods. The ripple effect of that morning on Millers Road continued to spread. Rachel's pediatric ward began coordinating directly with the clinic, recognizing that families struggling with children's medical bills often had to make impossible choices about their pets' care as well. The partnership led to an innovative program where therapy dogs, trained under Max's watchful supervision, visited children in long-term care. James, now a precocious toddler, became the unofficial mascot of these visits, his own story of survival and thriving inspiring parents facing similar challenges. Eleanor took particular pride in these developments, seeing how her daughter's love for both animals and children had somehow manifested in this unexpected way. She spent more time in the pediatric ward than she did at charity galas now, her social circle transforming as dramatically as her priorities had. Karen's clinic had to expand to meet the growing demands of the Foundation's work. The renovation included a proper children's play area, counseling rooms for families working with the Foundation, and an enhanced medical facility. Throughout the construction, Max maintained his role as chief inspector, paying particular attention to the safety features around areas designated for children. The contractor learned to wait for the dog's approval. Before considering any child-centered space complete, David managed the expansion project while continuing his regular duties. His business courses proving invaluable as the operation grew more complex. One afternoon, while reviewing blueprints with Robert, he realized how far he'd come from the desperate young father who'd once seen no way forward. The older man seemed to read his thoughts, placing a firm hand on his shoulder, in the way fathers do when words aren't quite enough. Detective Chen's pilot program, inspired by their case, was showing promising results across the city. She brought the statistics to a Foundation board meeting. Families in crisis were reaching out for help earlier, prevented from reaching the breaking point by the knowledge that help was available. As she shared the numbers, Chen watched James playing with Jessica Torres's daughter in the corner of the boardroom. Supervised by Max, the dog had somehow known to be extra gentle with these children who had faced early trauma, his protective instinct extending to every child who came through the Foundation's doors. The meeting ended with a new initiative proposal, a formal partnership between law enforcement, social services, and the Foundation to create a city-wide safety net for families in crisis. As the board members discussed logistics, James toddled over to Max, wrapping his arms around the dog in a gesture that had become symbolic of everything they'd built, strength found in unexpected places, and love that bridged all barriers. The first anniversary of the Sarah Mitchell Foundation coincided with James's second birthday. The celebration was held in the newly expanded clinic's community room, which had once been a storage space for medical supplies. The walls, now painted in warm colors, displayed photos chronicling the Foundation's journey, including the newspaper clipping of Max's heroic discovery that had started it all. The retired K-9 moved through the gathered crowd with dignified purpose, somehow managing to keep track of every child present while maintaining his position as James's primary guardian. David watched his son navigate the room with confident steps, stopping to hug each person he recognized. His social ease a stark contrast to the frightened father David had been just 2 years ago. The sight of James naturally gravitating between him and the Whitakers, completely secure in his expanded family's love, made his heart swell with gratitude. Karen had organized a special presentation for the event, gathering testimonials from families the Foundation had helped. Jessica Torres stood at the podium, her once sick cat now healthy and purring in her arms, as she explained how the Foundation's support had prevented her from having to choose between her pet's life and her daughter's medical needs. Behind her, a slideshow played showing similar stories, families who had found hope through the unique combination of veterinary care, social support, and community connection that the Foundation provided. Robert Whitaker, watching from his seat beside Eleanor, reached for his wife's hand as they saw their daughter's legacy taking shape in ways they had never imagined. The corporate lawyer who had once wielded influence through aggressive litigation now found himself moved to tears by simple stories of compassion and second chances. Detective Chen's arrival at the celebration carried special significance. She came with news that the police department was officially adopting their model citywide, creating a network of support services designed to catch families before they reached crisis points. As she shared the details with the gathering, Chen found herself repeatedly glancing at Max, who had positioned himself between James and the cake table. With professional dedication, the dog's instincts had not only saved a life that morning on Miller's Road, they had sparked a revolution in how communities could support their most vulnerable members. Rachel, standing nearby with her latest reports on the Foundation's impact on pediatric care access, smiled as she watched James attempt to sneak a finger full of frosting past his K-9 guardian. Max's gentle headshake was all it took to redirect the toddler's attention to more appropriate pre-cake activities. The evening's most powerful moment came when David took the podium. His voice, once uncertain in public settings, now carried the quiet authority of someone who had lived the journey he described. He spoke about hitting rock bottom, about the desperate choice he'd made that morning, and about the extraordinary chain of love and support that had lifted not just him and James, but an entire community. As he talked, Eleanor moved to stand beside him, her hand resting supportively on his shoulder, a gesture that would have seemed impossible 2 years ago. David shared their vision for the Foundation's future, expanding to neighboring cities, creating a model that could be replicated nationwide. The focus would remain on the intersection of animal and human welfare, recognizing how healing often came through unexpected channels. Throughout his speech, Max maintained eye contact from his position beside James's chair, as if offering the same steady support he'd provided since that first life-changing morning. The celebration concluded with a ceremony that brought tears to many eyes. Karen announced the creation of a new program within the Foundation, the Max's Heroes Initiative, designed specifically to train rescued dogs as therapy animals for families in crisis. The first class of dogs would be starting their training the following week, with Max serving as the program's inspiration and unofficial mentor as she made the announcement. James broke free from his grandfather's hold and ran to wrap his arms around Max's neck, a gesture caught perfectly by the event photographer. The resulting image would soon hang in the Foundation's main hall, a rescued child embracing his rescuer, surrounded by the family that fate, love, and one very special dog had built. As the guests began to leave, carrying pieces of birthday cake and new hope for their own challenges, David stood in the doorway of the clinic that had become so much more than a workplace. Max leaned against his leg, both of them watching James fall asleep in Eleanor's arms. While Robert gathered the toddler's many presents, the night air carried the promise of more good work to come. More lives to touch, more healing to facilitate, all because of a morning walk that had changed everything. The first signs were subtle, Max taking longer to get up in the mornings, sleeping more than usual, his muzzle showing more grey than anyone wanted to acknowledge. Karen noticed it first. her veterinary training making it impossible to ignore the signs of aging in her faithful companion. The dog still performed his duties with unwavering dedication, watching over James and monitoring the clinic's activities, but there was a slowness to his movements that hadn't been there before. David caught her concerned looks during Max's weekly checkups, understanding growing in his chest like a weighted stone. James, now approaching his 3rd birthday, seemed to sense the change too, becoming gentler in his play with Max, often choosing to sit quietly beside the dog rather than engaging in their usual more energetic games. The bond between them had evolved into something more tender, as if the child instinctively understood his guardian's changing needs. The Foundation's success had brought new challenges and responsibilities, but everything seemed to pause when Max had his first health scare. It happened during a routine therapy session with one of their client families. Max had been demonstrating his calm presence with a traumatized child when his back legs suddenly gave out. The incident lasted only moments, but it sent shockwaves through their tight-knit community. Rachel immediately cleared her schedule to consult with Karen on treatment options, while Eleanor and Robert leveraged their connections to bring in the best veterinary specialists. The waiting room filled with concerned clients and their pets, all of whom had been touched by Max's special brand of healing over the years. David found himself holding James extra tight that night, watching as his son carefully arranged his favorite stuffed animals around Max's bed as if they could stand guard over their guardian. Karen's diagnosis was both professional and heartbreaking. Age-related degenerative issues common in German Shepherds, particularly those who had served in K-9 units. The specialists confirmed her findings, but offered hope in the form of new treatments and therapy options. The Foundation, in a unanimous board decision, created a new fund specifically for retiring service animals, with Max as its first beneficiary during his recovery period. The clinic's dynamics shifted subtly to accommodate his needs. James appointed himself Max's official assistant, solemnly helping to carry the water bowl and announcing when it was time for the dog's medication, tasks that David and Karen supported, understanding how important it was for both child and dog to maintain their special connection. The sight of the toddler reading stories to Max during rest periods became a common and touching scene in the clinic's quiet corners. Detective Chen visited regularly during this period, often bringing other officers who had worked with Max during his service years. Their presence seemed to energize him, and he would sit a little straighter, some of his old alertness returning as they shared stories of his K-9 days. It was during one of these visits that James first heard detailed accounts of Max's career, how many lives he had saved, how many families he had helped reunite. The stories took on special meaning as James connected them to his own rescue, beginning to understand the deeper significance of Max's role in their lives. Eleanor, who had been quietly documenting these stories, surprised everyone by presenting a children's book manuscript she had written about Max's journey from police dog to family guardian. The project became a family endeavor, with Robert handling the legal aspects, Rachel ensuring medical accuracy, and James contributing his own crayon illustrations. The reality of Max's aging brought their family closer in unexpected ways. The Sunday dinners became longer, more intimate affairs, with everyone lingering to spend extra time with him. The Whitakers had practically moved their lives closer to the clinic, their original home now used mainly for holidays. David found himself sharing deeper conversations with Eleanor about Sarah, about loss and love and the ways life surprised you with new chapters. Just when you thought the story was over, through it all, Max maintained his protective watch over their expanding family, his physical limitations doing nothing to diminish his spiritual presence in their lives. One particularly meaningful evening, as they all gathered in the clinic's garden for a quiet celebration of Max's birthday, James spontaneously gathered everyone into a group hug around the dog. The moment was captured by Karen's camera, a family bound not by blood but by love, centered around the four-legged guardian who had made it all possible. In the photo, Max's eyes remained alert and loving, even as his body showed its age, proving that some forms of strength only grow deeper with time. The publication of Eleanor's children's book, Max's Mission, coincided with an important milestone at the clinic. The Foundation's therapy dog training program was graduating its first class, and Max, despite his limited mobility, insisted on being present for the ceremony. The new dogs, all rescues themselves, had been trained using the gentle methods that Max had naturally demonstrated throughout his years of service. James, now an eloquent 3-year-old, had appointed himself the official ribbon distributor for the graduation ceremonies. He took his duties seriously, carefully presenting each new therapy dog with their official Foundation bandana, while Max watched from his specially padded observation spot, his tail thumping proudly against the floor. The sight of the aging guardian watching over his successors brought tears to many eyes in the audience, especially those who remembered their own first encounters with him. Karen had transformed part of the clinic into a permanent training facility, with the new program incorporating everything they had learned from Max's natural abilities. The veteran K-9 had shown them how to identify dogs with the right temperament for therapy work, and more importantly, how to nurture those instincts. David found himself increasingly involved in the training program, his own journey of rehabilitation giving him unique insight into both the human and animal aspects of healing. During training sessions, he would often share his story with new handlers, Max lying faithfully at his feet, both of them living testaments to the power of second chances. The bond between them had evolved into something that transcended the physical limitations age had imposed, becoming a blueprint for the kind of connections they hoped to foster through the Foundation's work. Eleanor's book became an unexpected catalyst for expansion, the simple yet powerful story of a police dog who found his true calling in saving both a baby and a father resonated deeply with readers. The Foundation began receiving inquiries from across the country, other communities wanting to replicate their model of integrated family and animal welfare services. Robert turned his legal expertise to creating a framework for partnership programs, while Rachel developed protocols for medical coordination between veterinary and pediatric services. Throughout this period of growth, Max remained the heart of their operation, his presence in the clinic's main office a constant reminder of their mission's origins. Even on his more difficult days, when movement was challenging, he maintained his watch over James and the steady stream of children who came through their doors. The impact of their work became evident in unexpected ways. Jessica Torres, one of their first cases, had completed her nursing degree with the Foundation's support and joined their staff as a family coordinator. Her daughter and James had become inseparable friends, often found playing under Max's watchful eye in the clinic's children's corner. The space that had once been a simple veterinary clinic had evolved into a true community center, where families could find support for both their animal and human needs. Detective Chen's department had fully integrated their prevention model into standard procedure, and similar programs were starting to appear in neighboring cities. Through it all, Max continued to teach them new lessons about resilience and adaptation. When he could no longer make his rounds through the clinic, families brought their cases to him, gathering around his bed to share their stories and receive his gentle acknowledgement. The Foundation's board meeting room wall now displayed hundreds of photos, each telling a story of lives transformed. Central to this display was the original news clipping about Max's discovery of James. Alongside current pictures of all the therapy dogs who had followed in his paw prints, James had started kindergarten, but still spent his afternoons at the clinic. Now helping to socialize rescue puppies under Max's supervision, the aging dog might have slowed physically, but his spirit remained as strong as ever, his wisdom continuing to guide their growing mission. One evening, as the family gathered for their weekly dinner, David watched his son lean against Max's side, reading aloud from Max's Mission, the story of their family's beginning. The book's final illustration showed a group of people and animals connected by invisible threads of love and support, centered around a proud German shepherd with knowing eyes. As James turned the pages, Max rested his head on the boy's lap, both of them surrounded by the family they had helped create, their legacy continuing to unfold in ways that went far beyond that fateful morning on Miller's Road. The autumn morning dawned crisp and clear, much like that fateful day 3 years ago. Karen knew the moment she woke up that this day would be different. Max hadn't risen from his bed, though his eyes followed her movements with the same loving attention they'd always held. His breathing was steady but shallow, his once powerful body now frail with age. She made the call she'd been dreading, to David first, then Rachel, the Whitakers, and finally Detective Chen. The Foundation's regular activities were quietly postponed, and the clinic cleared except for essential care. As the sun climbed higher, their family gathered one by one, drawn by the unspoken understanding that their faithful guardian was preparing for his final watch. James, wise beyond his years in the way children sometimes are with animals, entered the room quietly and took his place beside Max's bed, his small hand gently stroking the dog's grey muzzle. David watched his son with Max, memories flooding back of that desperate morning that had changed everything. The dog's intervention hadn't just saved James's life, it had saved David's soul, given him purpose, family, and a chance to become the father he'd always wanted to be. Eleanor and Robert arrived with arms full of Max's favorite treats and the first printed copy of Max's Mission, which had just won a Children's Book Award for its message of hope and redemption. The book's success meant that Max's story would continue inspiring others long after this day. As they settled around his bed, Max summoned the strength to thump his tail against the floor one last time. Acknowledging his family's presence, Karen sat closest to his head, her veterinary professionalism temporarily abandoned as she held her partner's paw. Remembering all the lives they'd touched together during their years of service, both in law enforcement and at the clinic, Rachel coordinated with the veterinary hospice team, ensuring Max's comfort while Detective Chen shared stories from his K-9 days. The tales of his heroic rescues and unwavering dedication blended seamlessly with accounts of his gentler mission at the clinic, where he had helped heal broken families and guide lost souls home. Through it all, James remained by Max's side, occasionally whispering secrets in the dog's ear or reading favorite passages from his grandmother's book. The Foundation's therapy dogs, Max's chosen successors, waited patiently in the next room, somehow understanding the solemnity of the moment. Jessica Torres arrived with food for the family, her own eyes wet with tears for the dog who had helped change her life's trajectory. The community Max had helped build rallied around him in his final hours, each person touching his fur or offering a gentle word of gratitude. As evening approached, Max's breathing became more labored. Karen knew it was time. With professional tenderness tempered by personal love, she prepared what was needed. While the family drew closer, James climbed carefully onto the bed. Settling against Max's side one last time, David held his son while Eleanor read the final chapter of Max's Mission aloud, the part about how love creates families in unexpected ways, and how some angels have 4 legs and fur. Max listened to the familiar words, his eyes moving from face to face as if memorizing his loved ones. His last conscious act was to turn his head toward James, giving the boy's hand a gentle lick before resting his muzzle in Karen's lap. The room fell silent, except for the sound of mourning doves outside the window, their soft calls a fitting tribute to a guardian's passing. With his family surrounding him, Max took his final breath, his spirit lifting as gently as autumn leaves in the wind. The sunset that evening painted the sky in shades of gold and purple, colors that seemed to honor Max's transition. The clinic's garden, where he had spent so many happy hours watching over playing children and healing families, would become his final resting place. As the family made their way home that night, James looked up at the stars appearing in the darkening sky. "Max is watching over all of us now," he said with childhood certainty. His hand tight in his father's grip, David looked at his son, then at the family around them. Karen, Rachel, the Whitakers, Detective Chen, all bound together by the love of one extraordinary dog. The Foundation would continue its work, guided by Max's example of unconditional love and unwavering dedication. His legacy lived on in every therapy dog that followed his path, every family that found healing within the clinic's walls, and every life touched by the ripples of that one fateful morning when a retired K-9 officer refused to walk past a hidden miracle in the bushes. The Foundation's first major event after Max's passing was the dedication of the Max Memorial Garden, transforming his final resting place into a healing space for both animals and humans. Karen had carefully designed the area with winding paths, comfortable benches, and specially selected plants that would bloom year-round. The centerpiece was a life-sized bronze statue of Max in his characteristic protective pose. Watching over a child reading a book, James had insisted on being the model for the child figure, and the artist had captured perfectly the bond between boy and guardian. The garden quickly became a favorite spot for therapy sessions, the peaceful setting helping troubled souls find comfort, just as Max had done in life. Each morning, David and James would stop there before starting their day, sometimes leaving a fresh tennis ball or favorite treat at the statue's base. The therapy dog program flourished, with each new class of dogs bringing their own unique gifts to the Foundation's work. Among them was Hope, a rescued German Shepherd mix who showed an uncanny ability to connect with children dealing with trauma, much like Max had done. Karen noticed how Hope would instinctively position herself between anxious children and perceived threats, offering the same steady presence that had been Max's hallmark. The dog had come to them from a local shelter, her own past of abandonment making her particularly attuned to those in need of second chances. James, now in kindergarten, but still spending his afternoons at the clinic, had taken a special interest in Hope's training. Under Karen's guidance, he helped socialize the new therapy dogs. His natural empathy and first-hand understanding of their mission, making him an unexpected but effective junior trainer. Eleanor's book had spawned a series, each volume focusing on different aspects of the Foundation's work through the lens of Max's legacy. Max's helpers and Max's family joined Max's mission on bookshelves across the country. Their success funding new programs and initiatives, Robert had transitioned fully from corporate law to managing the Foundation's legal affairs, finding more satisfaction in helping families stay together than he ever had in his previous career. The Whitakers' home, once a showcase of wealth and status, had been converted into a weekend retreat center where families could bond with therapy dogs in a calm, supportive environment. Sarah's old room became a library filled with resources for families in crisis, her mother finally finding peace in using her daughter's memory to help others heal. Detective Chen's department had fully integrated animal therapy into their family crisis intervention program. With several of Max's graduates now working alongside officers, the sight of a therapy dog wearing the Foundation's signature bandana had become a symbol of hope in the community. Particularly in situations involving children, Chen often found herself sharing Max's story with new recruits, explaining how one dog's actions had revolutionized their approach to family services. The prevention program she had helped develop, inspired by David and James's case, had been adopted by neighboring cities, creating a network of support that caught families before they reached their breaking point. Each success story added another photo to the clinic's wall of memories, where Max's original newspaper clipping held the place of honor as the Foundation prepared to celebrate its 4th anniversary. James made a special request. He wanted to start a scholarship program for veterinary students who showed the same devotion to healing that Max had embodied. The idea quickly gained support, with Karen developing a curriculum that combined traditional veterinary medicine with the holistic approach to family healing that had become their trademark. The first recipient would begin their internship in the spring, learning not just about animal care, but about the intricate ways that humans and animals could help each other heal. On the evening they announced the scholarship, James stood at the podium, his father's hand on his shoulder, and spoke about the dog who had saved his life in more ways than one. The audience, filled with families whose lives had been touched by Max's legacy, listened in respectful silence as the young boy described his earliest memory, the feeling of absolute safety in the presence of a guardian angel with fur and 4 paws. 5 years to the day after Max's passing, James, now 8 years old, stood at the entrance of Miller's Road, holding his father's hand. The street had transformed from a desolate industrial area into a thriving community center. Anchored by the expanded Sarah Mitchell Foundation campus, the old clinic had grown into a comprehensive family wellness center, complete with veterinary services, counseling facilities, and a state-of-the-art training center for therapy dogs. Where once there had been abandoned buildings, there now stood hope in concrete form. And it all began with a morning walk and a dog who refused to pass by a hidden miracle. David watched his son trace the commemorative paw prints embedded in the sidewalk, each one leading visitors through the story of their journey. Ending at the Max Memorial Garden where it all came together, Karen's vision for the Foundation had exceeded everyone's expectations. The therapy dog program had expanded nationwide. With satellite centers in 20 states, each following the model that Max had inspired, Hope, now the program's lead therapy dog, had trained dozens of successors. Creating a legacy of her own while honoring Max's memory, the old clinic's waiting room had become a hall of remembrance, its walls covered with thousands of photographs, each one telling a story of healing, second chances, and the unbreakable bonds between humans and animals. James had taken to giving tours to visitors, his natural storytelling ability bringing to life the tales behind each image. Always starting with the faded newspaper clipping that had first announced his rescue, Eleanor and Robert Whitaker had discovered a sense of purpose that their wealthy retirement could never have provided. Their foundation work had given them a way to honor both their daughter's memory and the grandchild they'd nearly lost to grief and desperation. Eleanor's book series had become a staple in children's hospitals and trauma centers across the country, while Robert's legal framework for family support services was being studied as a model for community intervention programs. The Whitakers had found that true happiness lay not in their country club membership or corporate success, but in the simple joy of watching families heal and grow stronger together. Their Sunday dinners, still a sacred tradition, now often included families currently going through the Foundation's programs, turning their table into a place of hope and connection. Detective Chen had risen to head her department's Family Services Division, implementing programs that emphasized prevention and support over punishment. The model she'd helped develop, inspired by David's case, had significantly reduced instances of family separation due to financial crisis. She still kept a photo of Max on her desk, using his story to remind her officers that sometimes the biggest impacts came from simply stopping to investigate something that seemed out of place. The department's K-9 units now included a therapy dog division. Their duties expanded to include family crisis intervention and community building. Each new class of police dogs trained alongside the Foundation's therapy animals, creating a unified approach to community service that bridged the gap between law enforcement and family support services. James's scholarship program had grown into a full fellowship, supporting veterinary students who committed to working with families in crisis. The first recipient was now running their own clinic in another state. Replicating the model that had saved James and his father, the Foundation's approach to integrated family and animal welfare had become the subject of research studies and documentary films. But for those who lived it daily, the magic remained in the simple moments. A child reading to a therapy dog, a family finding strength to stay together, a life being gently guided back onto the path of hope. Rachel had expanded the medical coordination program to include a network of healthcare providers willing to work with families in need, ensuring that no parent would face the desperate choices that had brought David to Miller's Road that fateful morning. As the sun set on the anniversary gathering, James released a handful of forget-me-not seeds in the memorial garden, a tradition he'd started to ensure that something new would always be growing in Max's special place. The garden had become a sanctuary where people came to find peace, share their stories, or simply sit in the presence of memories that had changed countless lives. David watched his son, now growing into a confident young boy with his mother's compassionate heart and his guardian angel's protective instincts. The Foundation's work would continue to evolve and grow. But its heart would always remain true to the lesson Max had taught them all, that love, whether it comes on 2 legs or 4, has the power to heal, transform and create families in the most unexpected ways. As night fell and stars began to appear, James looked up at the sky and smiled, secure in the knowledge that somewhere above, a faithful guardian was still watching over them all. His mission continued through every life touched by his enduring legacy.